Hi, thank you. I think one of the really wonderful things about this panel is how well all the presentations go together, but there is invariably going to be a bit of crossover, and particularly with the previous presentation, so I just want to apologise for that in advance, and hopefully we can skip over some of the things that Mylene talked about. So I'm a PhD candidate in Museum and Heritage Studies at the University of Sydney, and my research areas are in heritage studies, history and Asian studies. And so I need to emphasise that I'm not an archaeologist, and I'm instead approaching my research from the perspective of critical heritage studies. This means that I'm interested in moving beyond the so-called authorised heritage discourse that sustains privileged narratives of nation and class. Instead, my research considers heritage sites and objects that have been overlooked or forgotten. Hence my interest in shipwrecks, which are often out of sight and out of mind until the point of discovery and excavation. So many of you would already be familiar with the Belitung or the Tang shipwreck, as it is now known. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about it today. I'll just give you a quick overview. Instead, I want to use the Belitung as a departure point for a discussion about how underwater cultural heritage is and has been valued in Indonesia, considering the contemporary legal and political framework, which is much of what Mylene talked about, but also thinking about the historical role of the maritime domain in the Indonesian national consciousness, and how this has changed in the 2 decades since the Belitung was discovered. I argue that the uneasy relationship the modern Indonesian nation has with the maritime domain, which is seen as a barrier rather than as a connecting device, has limited Indonesia's engagement with its underwater cultural heritage, but that this may now be changing with a renewed maritime focus. To do this, I will look at the political situation in 1998 when the Belitung was discovered. I'll consider the impact of reformasi and decentralisation on heritage legislation and the heritage context in Indonesia, and conclude by considering the current status of underwater cultural heritage in Indonesia within the context of President Jokowi's so-called global maritime axis. We've seen this slide before in the opening session, it's obviously a popular map. So the Belitung was discovered and excavated in 1998-1999. And it's a 9th century ship, and it's historically significant because it constitutes the earliest evidence of maritime trade between the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East and Tang Dynasty China. The ship originated in modern-day Oman or Yemen, had travelled east to Asia, and is believed to have been on its return journey when it sank with a very large cargo of Tang Dynasty ceramics. The Belitung was commercially excavated by a company called Seabed Explorations, and the objects were exported to New Zealand and Germany for conservation, before being sold to Singapore for US $32 million in 2004-2005. After being exhibited at a number of museums in Singapore, as well as at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, the collection has just gone on permanent display at the Asian Civilizations Museum, and I'm very excited that the curator is here. As many of you would be aware, the Belitung was also intended for display at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, but the exhibition was cancelled due to controversy over the for-profit nature of the excavation. Concerns were raised about whether commercial involvement in the excavation of the wreck had tainted the archaeological material. There is still no agreement on how to best resolve such issues, and as Mylene has just outlined, the contradictory and ambivalent nature of Indonesian legislation relating to underwater cultural heritage makes the issue even more challenging. So that's just a very quick outline, and I'll now turn to the heritage context in Indonesia at the time of the Belitung's discovery in 1998. So as we've just heard, the relevant heritage legislation was Act No. 5 of 1992 on cultural heritage preservation, or Benda Cagar Budaya. This legislation provided for objects of historical, cultural and scientific significance that were more than 50 years old. There were a few exceptions, but generally cultural property was defined as being the property of the Indonesian government. These exceptions were private ownership of family heirlooms, which was called warisan, or objects that are common or duplicates. Criticisms of this law included that it had simply adopted wholesale most of the content of the 1931 Dutch-issued Monuments Ordinance. Furthermore, the 1992 legislation did not provide for intangible heritage or natural heritage. Importantly, for our purposes today, it did not include the issue of underwater sites either. The only legislation that directly related to underwater cultural heritage was a presidential decree issued in 1989. This decree had come about in response to the looting of the Geldermalsen, and it reflected the nature of Indonesia's concerns in relation to underwater cultural heritage. The focus was not on protection and preservation, but on asserting ownership and creating economic opportunities. The legislation formalised state ownership of all wrecks in Indonesian waters. It also established the National Committee for Salvage and Utilisation of Valuable Cargo Objects from Sunken Ships, or PANAS BMKT. This committee was authorised to issue excavation permits to third parties through an Indonesian licensee. Under this legislation, ships and their cargoes were constituted primarily as economic rather than historical resources, resources that belonged to the state. It was under this legislation, the 1989 Shipwrecks Decree and the 1992 Heritage Act, that the Belitung, as well as a number of other shipwrecks, as we've just heard, were excavated. During this time, Indonesia was undergoing its most profound political transformation in decades. 1998 was the year that President Suharto fell from power, and his demise signalled the end of 3 decades of authoritarian rule under the Orde Baru, or the New Order, and the start of reformasi. These are some of the 60,000 objects excavated from the Belitung in 1998 when reformasi started. So the reformasi era was marked by a process of democratisation, the rise of civil society, and growing demands for regional autonomy. There were a number of developments during reformasi that relate to underwater cultural heritage. The first of these was the shift from a centralised to a decentralised government. This policy of regional autonomy was the most important political change since Suharto's fall, and saw power devolve to the district level. One of the consequences was the dividing up of Indonesia's sea territory into 3 zones, administered by regencies, provinces and the state. This has led to confusion and disagreement about who owns what, with implications for wrecks found within the 4-mile or the 12-mile zone. Second, at an international level, UNESCO introduced the Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage in 2001. The Convention, as we know, preferences in situ conservation and bans commercial exploitation. And clearly Indonesia's 1989 shipwrecks legislation directly contravenes this convention. Indonesia has not signed this convention, and in fact the only country in Asia to have signed it is Cambodia. Most other countries, including Indonesia, prefer instead to manage their underwater cultural heritage through domestic legislation. The third point I want to note is that post-Suharto, culture was no longer part of the education portfolio, where it had been since culture was first elevated to ministry level in 1948 under President Sukarno. Culture remained within the Ministry of Education portfolio throughout Sukarno and Suharto's presidencies for 50 years. However, for 2 months in 1998, under Suharto, culture was in fact in 2 ministries, the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture and the Ministry of Education and Culture. This situation continued under President Habibie from May 1998 to October 1999. But when he was replaced with President Wahid, culture was moved into the Tourism and Culture portfolio. Culture remained in the Tourism portfolio until 2011, when it was moved back to Education under President Yudhoyono. President Jokowi has maintained this allocation of ministerial responsibilities. We could also talk separately about the creative economy and creative industries initiatives that have emerged in recent years. But more salient for our discussion today, however, is to consider how culture has moved between the education and tourism portfolios in the past 2 decades. I would argue that the Belitung, discovered in the same year that culture first moved beyond the education portfolio and into the tourism portfolio, is a prime example of the tensions in Indonesia about the role of culture as something that is educative, or something that is more closely associated with the economic opportunities arising out of tourism. The growth of the local heritage movement in Indonesia can also be traced to this period, and I have listed some of the key developments here. I think it's important to note the contrast in attitudes to heritage between the government, which is more resource-focused, and the grassroots organisations, which tend to be more identity-focused. I'm not going to won't go through them all, but suffice to say that this burgeoning awareness within Indonesia reflects significant changes in the international heritage community, which also witnessed developments in both heritage theory and practice from the 1990s onwards. While these developments demonstrated an increasing awareness in Indonesia of the need to protect and preserve Indonesia's natural and cultural heritage, there was little, if any, recognition or incorporation of underwater cultural heritage into their activities. However, there were changes at the legislative level. In 2010, Indonesia introduced revised heritage legislation, Act Number 11 of 2010 on cultural heritage. This is the current heritage legislation in Indonesia and replaced the 1992 legislation. Many of the articles remain the same. However, there were a couple of changes worth noting today. First of all, cultural heritage objects and sites can now be on land and or water, whereas in the 1992 legislation there was no mention of water. Also, Article 5 provides national criteria for assessing and inscribing Indonesian cultural heritage properties. These criteria are vague and ambiguous. For example, it's not clear if to be listed as national cultural heritage, an object must meet just one of the criteria or a minimum of criteria or all of the criteria. In any case, this 2010 legislation prompted two changes. The first was that because of the ambiguity caused by the new legislation's incorporation of heritage from water, Indonesia placed a 5-year moratorium on the issuing of all new licences to commercial excavation companies. However, these legislative revisions have not yet been passed, even though the time limit on this moratorium lapsed at the end of 2015. And I'm very interested, as you are, Marlene, to see where it goes next. I think this delay can be attributed to differences of opinion within the Indonesian government about the management of underwater cultural heritage. The second development arising from the 2010 legislation was the establishment of an expert team on national heritage, which is responsible for assessing and shortlisting national cultural heritage according to the criteria specified in the legislation. This brings me to my final point, which is to consider the current status of underwater cultural heritage in Indonesia within the context of Jokowi's so-called global maritime axis. In his inaugural speech in October 2014, Jokowi stated, "We have long turned our backs on the sea." He framed the importance of Indonesia's maritime character in philosophical and historical terms. Invoking the notion of himself as captain of the good ship Indonesia, he articulated 5 key components of this new maritime strategy, and I've listed them on the slide. These build on Indonesia's archipelagic identity and celebrate the ocean as a source of prosperity and connection. While Jokowi's expanded vision of maritime Indonesia focuses on economics and security, there is, as we can see, also a role for culture. This new vision indicates a departure from previous administrations, such as the New Order, which primarily conceived of Indonesia as an agrarian nation separated by the ocean. Jokowi's reframing of the sea builds on themes developed by Indonesia's most famous novelist, Pramudia Anantatua, in his novel Arus Balik, or Backward Current. In this alternative and even subversive vision of how we understand Indonesia and read its histories, Pramudia conceived of the ocean as a connective device in Indonesian histories, and as something that facilitated, rather than inhibited, the flow of goods, ideas and people across and beyond the archipelago. Ships such as the Belitung are central to Pramudia's notion of historical connection and prosperity. They represent a type of cultural heritage that is by its very nature transnational, and in the case of the Belitung, one that literally moved between many different places both in the 9th century and since its discovery in the late 20th century. While Jokowi's vision of a global maritime axis is arguably anti-transnational, as seen by his policy of blowing up illegal foreign fishing boats, he and Pramudia do share a vision of the ocean as something that holds the nation together and makes it strong. For Jokowi, he does not value transnational heritage as much as he values the sea as a new way of framing Indonesian national heritage. However, critics argue that Jokowi has failed to put forward a detailed strategy for the implementation of these new maritime cultural policies. Many issues remain unresolved, including the moratorium on commercial excavation and the question of whether Jokowi's maritime vision is too ambitious to be fully realised. Despite this, I'm going to put my neck out and say that underwater cultural heritage will receive increasing attention and scrutiny in Indonesia, in no small part due to the appointment late last year of Dr. Hilmar Farid as the Director General of the Directorate of Cultural Heritage Preservation and Museums, which falls under the Ministry of Education and Culture. Before his appointment as Director General, Farid was an historian, activist, and founder of the Indonesian Institute of Social History. He was born in Germany and has written extensively about the historical and political dimension of Pramudia's work. He also studied under renowned maritime historian of Indonesia, Professor Adrian Lapian, who has written about the need for Indonesians to think about their nation not as a nation of islands, but as a sea that is sown with islands. In a November 2014 speech about the backward current of culture, which of course draws on the title of Pramudia's novel, Arus Balik, Farid concurred with Jokowi's assessment that Indonesians had turned their back on the sea. Whereas Jokowi, as well as the Suharto-era nationalists, views this as an economic and security problem, Farid argues that it was essentially a cultural problem, and that the disappearance of Indonesia's previously strong maritime culture could be traced to the dominance of the Dutch East Indies Company in the 17th century. I think Farid's appointment as Director General signals the start of an exciting time to be researching heritage, especially underwater cultural heritage in Indonesia. The expert team on national heritage, which I mentioned earlier, and which operates under Farid's leadership, has started to steer their attention towards maritime cultural heritage, including listing 3 historic ports in Sumatra. Farid has publicly expressed his hopes that this renewed focus will revive the Indonesian public's collective memory of their maritime past. Farid has also spoken about plans to develop a cultural program known as Jalur Rumpah Nusantara, or Indonesia's Spice Trail. Perhaps longer term, we may also see the development of a state museum dedicated to underwater cultural heritage in Indonesia. There's already been speculation that with each new port or port redevelopment, they're going to build a new maritime museum. I think this is quite ambitious, but we'll see. Calls for a new maritime museum go back at least as far as 2010, and there are only 2 state-run maritime museums in Indonesia at the moment, and as Mei Lin has written in her new chapter, they do lack archaeological perspective. So to conclude, I want to come back to Farid, who has challenged Indonesians to revive the capabilities, systems of knowledge, outlook and way of life that had been stunted for hundreds of years. Echoing Professor Lapian's view of Indonesia as a sea that is sown with islands, Farid has called Indonesia a country that is sprinkled with cultural heritage from Sumatra to Papua. As I hope to have demonstrated today, the decades since the discovery of the Belitung have seen significant political and regulatory changes. While there are differences in their perspectives, with Farid favouring a culturally and historically grounded approach, and Jokowi more motivated by economic and security concerns, I think that when it comes to their collaboration and the consequences for underwater cultural heritage in Indonesia, it is going to be very much a case of watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Biarta from. I would like just to comment on your presentation from both of you, Dr. Megan and Ibu Natali. Personally, I appreciate your concern about the Indonesian marine cultural heritage. I think the story shows that what you have presented is more or less the conditions like that. But probably we have to know that the vast area of Indonesian sea or the Indonesian maritime is very complex to protect. And apart from what Indonesia thinks about this cultural heritage or economic resource, but other people think it's part of the economic resource. So that's a complicated effort of Indonesian government to protect its cultural heritage is there. And I think what we need is the probably international support on this management, protection, and utilization of Indonesia cultural heritage. And I think that can change a lot. That's one part. Another point I'd like to make is the presentation for Dr. Maiden Chua, that on your boxes, you said 1989 is the change panas to marine affairs and fisheries. That is incorrect. Marine Department of Marine or Ministry of Marine Fisheries was established in the late 1999, early 2000. So that's one. But panas was there, another panas, the earlier panas. So the panas is the committee for national committee for underwater or shipwreck heritage, something like that.
It's a very long.
Yeah, it's very long. So once again, I like to appreciate your concern on that, and like to promote support for Indonesian government and Indonesian society effort on protection of our cultural heritage. Thank you.